Happy Thanksgiving! The Atari Jaguar is 30 years old today, so I think it's best to stir the hornet's nest and bring up its failure and what maybe could have saved this system. Don't worry though, I promise to make this take a little different from the norm, at least from what I've seen out there. Now I do this as over the years there have been no shortage of threads on Jaguar forums and even YouTube videos asking the same thing, with people proffering up things like it needed arcade ports or a CD drive or it should have been released earlier and so on. I do agree that the Jaguar hardware being buggy and not designed with texture mapping in mind hindered it, but I am going to endeavor to argue here that even with faulty or low-powered hardware, you could have made it successful. My angle, though, is going to be from a marketing perspective, and that's because professionally, I've been involved in product marketing since 2016, where I've been in charge of promoting products for an arcade equipment distributor out of Florida called Primetime Amusements. I've learned a lot of interesting things there combined with running my own arcade business. Of course, what Primetime does is known as B2B or business-to-business marketing and not business-to-consumer or B2C. The Jaguar and every other console would use B2C strategy. First, let's take a look at what the market landscape for gaming was like in 1993. Now, it was somewhat of an odd space. The buzzwords that year were multimedia and texture mapping, and this was pushed in good part by the growing presence of CD media drives, particularly with multimedia. PC games like Myst and The Seventh Guest really pushed CD-ROM adoption on the PC side. I remember getting Myst and Wing Commander 2 for my 386, but not very much for Myst. Later I grabbed Return to Zork, and that was my favorite. Still, CDs were the talk of the town. Sega had launched the Sega CD the year prior, and NEC had also launched a CD add-on for the TurboGrafx 16. There was talk of a CD drive for the SNES called the PlayStation, but not much was known about it publicly at that point. And that year, Atari's rival in the computer space, Commodore, launched the CD32 system, and a month before the Jag launched, the Panasonic 3DO was released, and while it was wholly CD-based, it came with a very hefty price tag. This was also the year that Doom had come along, which solidified the domination of the IBM-compatible PC, while consoles enjoyed ports of popular arcade games such as Street Fighter II or Mortal Kombat. Speaking of arcades, Daytona USA was launched in that summer, making everyone focus on this hot new graphics technique called texture mapping. NBA Jam had changed how people thought of sports games, and it, along with Mortal Kombat, have pushed the boundaries of digitized sprites. Daytona in particular and texture mapping is important to remember as we discuss the Jag though. Much more than this happened that year, but I think it's sufficient to set the table for the situation that the Jag was entering. I could also point out that the Lynx was competing and losing against the Game Boy. The Sega Game Gear was also failing against the Game Boy's dominance. Now, another note to keep in mind as we talk about this is that marketing a product in 2023 is entirely different than it was in 1993. The word internet was not common vernacular at that point, even with people who might have used a computer every single day. Lots of people still didn't use computers, though, on a daily basis at that time, and they got their news through TV, radio, magazines, newspapers, print catalogs, and so on. Gaming news was almost exclusively shared through magazines like GamePro, EGM, GameFan, and Game Informer. Home phones could only make or take calls, they couldn't even send texts, and so you didn't have them as computing devices or news sources. And cell phones, the few that were out there, was something that only very wealthy people had, but even then, those couldn't do a tenth of what phones can do today. Anyways, let's first define what success is in terms of the Jaguar. I don't think that it was reasonable to believe that the Jaguar as released could have become the dominant game console of the scene. It was designed in the 1990 through 92 period, and its focus was on strong 2D effects with some 3D capabilities. However, when Daytona USA came along and blew everyone's minds with its 60 frames per second texture map 3D graphics, it was way beyond what Nintendo had managed with their Super Effects chip and Star Fox. And while the Jaguar was being designed, they weren't thinking of texture mapping but ground shading. Sure, the Jaguar could do texture maps, but because it wasn't designed with that in mind, it was slow to do so. Now, why didn't Atari delay the Jaguar to make it more capable of that, you might ask? Well, when Daytona came along, the Jag spec had already been locked in for the past year. It was in the middle of manufacturing at that point, so had they slammed the brakes on all of that, it would have been an extremely costly decision, one that perhaps Atari couldn't afford to have made. It also could have delayed the system by quite a while. They didn't know at that point that the PlayStation would be what it became, nor that it would be great at textured 3D. So they made their decision to continue based off of the situation to forge ahead. Success, as I think we can define it, is that the system would have sold well enough to see the growth of the Atari brand, expansion of Atari's development abilities in-house, and for them to have eventually launched the Jaguar 2. And I think that with the hardware being what it was, that was doable, but you would have needed a really good marketing team to have helped make that happen. From a marketing perspective, the Jaguar is a great case study of what not to do. So let's look at that and see what one should have done differently. When you launch a product like a game console, there are two key periods that you absolutely have to nail, otherwise the chances of success become slim: the pre-launch phase and the launch phase. In both of these, a good marketer doesn't want to get bogged down in complex details but wants KISS. Keep it simple, stupid. The simpler you can convey why someone should buy this new $250 console, the better. Pre-launch matters because this is the first opportunity for the public to hear about your product. As humans, we form our opinions very quickly and based off of initial information. Sadly, this has negative consequences, such as when people form a deep emotional opinion based off of a headline and don't read deep into a story. Now, the same can happen with a product. If you hear negative things about it at first, it's going to be very difficult to overcome that initial impression. This is why having a sound marketing strategy in place early on is crucial, and I'm not just talking about ads either. I also mean in terms of rumors that the company will spread to start generating buzz. Atari had been hinting at the Jaguar for a while, spreading rumors about their powerful 64-bit system in game magazines and among industry insiders. Unfortunately, this was a big mistake, and one that haunts the system to this day. I'm sure there'll be a comment about it somewhere in this video. It's also one that could have been avoided. But how? When Atari decided to forge ahead with the Jaguar, they should have put together a good marketing team that would craft a message and a vision for the console, from rumors down to print ads. They would have determined who their target market was and based off of sales data on pre-existing consoles like the Lynx, 7800, and to a degree their ST, TT, and Falcon computers to figure out where their customers were at and what they wanted. A good marketing team would also sit down with the R&D side of the company, or in this case Flare 1, who designed the Jaguar hardware, to learn the strengths and the weaknesses of the platform. They should also have discussed these things with software developers to get a real sense of what the system was capable of and what experiences it would provide to the buyers. Of course, this would be a two-way street, assuming that they had done their research on the target market so that devs could learn what it is that Atari customers want in a game system that perhaps they were missing from the likes of Sega and Nintendo. From this, the team should have war-gamed out a variety of scenarios. How will our competitors attack the system's weaknesses? Is there anything that can create a bad impression for our system that we can't easily explain away? What is it that gamers want in an Atari system? How can we explain that to them quickly and easily? Unfortunately, if they did any of this, they decided to copy Sega's marketing tactic of using bits. Bits was a double-edged sword. Yes, it could quickly convey power to a customer, especially if you're saying 64-bit over 16. But it doesn't tell you what kind of experiences you'd really get out of that. Does saying 64-bit tell you that you're going to get an arcade experience or that your RPGs will be more realistic? Not necessarily. This was made worse in the Jaguar's case by the specs. Had the marketing team really wargamed this out, they would have realized the folly of promoting 64-bit all over the place, as the specs of the Jaguar had 3 32-bit processors in the mix. This is something that competitors could and did, such as in the case of Trip Hawkins of 3DO, seize on to paint the console in a negative light. You come along and say 64-bit, but then competitors say you're lying because there are 32-bit parts in it and you've admitted that through your specs. What should have been a simple explanation becomes a complicated one, and instead of talking about games, you get bogged down in pointless but negative minutia. It became worse when Atari's marketing was all about power, and then many games like Dino Dudes, Raiden, or Bubsy didn't look any better than something on a 16-bit system. Then when the 32-bit PSX came along with much better graphics, everyone laughed Atari to scorn. The lesson here is, if a weakness in the system is complicated to explain away, then don't highlight it in your marketing. Instead, focus on your true strengths. So what was the strength of the Jag? It was designed as a 2D system that could handle loads of sprites at 16.7 million colors and manipulate those sprites in all sorts of ways. It could produce CD quality sound from a cartridge. It could handle 3D without an extra chip. Of course, another thing in marketing is that of show, don't tell. In other words, showing the strengths through great games is far more effective than just telling them 64-bit. Now, of course, this can be outside of marketing's control, depending on the situation. They can't show the abilities on the system if a game developer hasn't produced those results. However, if the marketing department is working with internal software development as well as with your third parties, then this can benefit both sides. Marketing gets to see what's in store that they can promote, while the developer can get feedback on what experiences customers really want, as I mentioned. I would also add that honesty is important. Of course, me just saying that you focus on strengths instead of weaknesses can sound like I'm saying to be dishonest, but here's what I mean. In the Jaguar press conference that happened in August of 1993 and later in press releases, they touted that both Cybermorph and Trevor McFur contained texture mapping. Neither game actually did, so they were being dishonest about that. Now, why did they do that? Well, Daytona USA came out in August of 1993, so immediately everybody was talking about texture mapping. And so they decided that to be on top of that, they would start touting that the Jaguar was capable of this new feat. Unfortunately, they didn't work with developers to get that in place with either game, so they should have left it out or focused on a game that was in development that did use texture mapping. One could also argue that them screaming 64-bit all the time was dishonest, as lots of consumers thought that Atari was lying when they said that, particularly when they saw games that didn't look any different or much different from the 16-bitters. Dishonesty in marketing quickly derails your message and makes consumers not trust you, and gaining that trust back is extremely difficult, if not impossible. Now we get to the launch. What happened with this phase was also botched. Atari decided to launch the Jag to two test markets in November 1993, New York and San Francisco. Only 10,000 units were available, and the general launch would happen in April of 1994. Only two games were available at this launch, Cybermorph and Trevor McFur. Despite all their efforts to scream from the rooftops about having the first 64-bit console, it wasn't enough to convince consumers to buy. So what should they have done differently? If you had the good team in place that would avoid talking bits and instead focus on the new experiences you get in both 2D and 3D realms, I first would have allocated units to more than 2 cities on the planet. From the target market research and sales data, Atari would know what the top 10 cities would have been as far as sales of the Lynx or the 7800 or both. Now, I have a hunch that this test market thing was an excuse that they could only get 10,000 units made in time for November, but maybe I'm wrong there. Regardless, let's say you only have 10,000 units to work with. Why not allocate those among the top 10 cities where you've seen good sales? I would have certainly have included European cities like London and Berlin there, since Atari had a loyal fan base in those countries. But even in the US, could have gotten this system into more hands across the country, which would have helped create more buzz. I have an anecdotal story about seeing this in action too. My best friend growing up his name was Trevor, and he had all sorts of game consoles. He had an Atari 2600, an Atari 800 XL, an NES, an SNES. I played Star Fox at his house, and I was blown away by that since I hadn't been to an arcade in years, and I didn't know about Daytona at that time. His brothers had a Sega Master System and a Genesis. His parents really had no problem getting them game consoles. In Christmas of 1993, my friend Trevor got a Panasonic 3DO. And I remember playing the FMV show game Twisted, as well as Samurai Showdown. But I was shocked by how expensive the thing was and asked why his mom got him that. She heard and explained that she tried to find a Jaguar, but that no one had it, so instead she got this much more expensive but hot item that everyone was talking about. That still seemed a little crazy for her to spend that much more money on it. I think she used a credit card or something. But regardless, I wonder how many other households skipped the Jaguar that holiday season simply because Atari decided to limit it to 2 cities. Keep in mind as well, online sales did not exist at that time. If you didn't live in New York and San Francisco, or there wasn't a catalog mail order option, then too bad. So how many sales did Atari miss out on from that mistake? Well, who knows, probably a lot. So let's say the good marketing team decided to spread the units around so more gamers could get one. Great, but what about the games? Only having 2 games was a negative, hindering the pre-launch as well as the launch. Especially in the Jags case, 1993 was really the only time the console will get a chance to make its strongest impact, and that's generally true for all consoles. Again, the pre-launch and launch periods are crucial. And particularly the first holiday season will determine the momentum that will affect the console from there on out. With only 2 games and a marketing campaign focused more on numbers rather than games, it was very much the wrong call. Of course, having more games ready to go in November 93 was likely easier said than done, but again, a good marketing team would have worked with the development side to make it happen. They would have convinced management that it was absolutely crucial to launch with as many games as you could possibly get, and to have those games looking fantastically better than anything that was available on competing consoles. They would have been leading the charge among the first wave of developers to highlight those strengths, and this would have been easiest to do with Atari's in-house guys, such as the ones that made Trevor McFur. Now, how many games should the system have launched with? Well, I don't know if there's a magic number, and of course quality is still important. There's plenty of room for debate here, but I think that at least 5 would have been useful, maybe 6. I'd keep Cybermorph as the pack-in unless you're able to find something more impressive. From the Jags library, it was a good early pick. Trevor McFur, well, I already did a video on how much fixing that turd needed, but what else should have Atari thrown their support and resources into? That year, 1993, Atari released Battlezone 2000 for the Lynx. As I mentioned in another video, they made the decision of developing a 3D version on that, then they locked it away and dumbed it down for the general release. In my humble opinion, they should have taken that 3D version and created a Jag launch title out of it. That also would have been more suited to the Jaguar's hardware and its controller, and it would have been an opportunity to showcase a second 3D game while using a title that many people loved from arcades. They could also say, we pioneered first-person shooter games with Battlezone, now we're pioneering 3D games at home with it. It would have been an easy sell. Another 3D game I would have pushed to get as a launch title is something from the Atari ST. 3D graphics was one place where the ST performed better than the Commodore Amiga, and what better way to show off the power of your new console than to port a 3D game to that and enhance it to show how superior the new hardware is. I would have pushed for either Interphase or RoboCop 3, maybe the latter since it had the RoboCop name to it and it was a first-person shooter. On the 2D side of things, I mentioned a game that should have been on the Jag in another video, and maybe the Lynx, called Commander Keen 4, or Commander Keen Goodbye Galaxy. This would have been an excellent choice for the platform, and would have made for a great launch title. id Software would have been capable of making it look vastly better than the 16-color PC game, and it would have brought a platformer in the vein of a Mario or a Sonic to the system. Commander Keen, as far as I know, never got a port to any console, so this would have been another easy sell. A challenge to get onto the system, but one worth pursuing, would have been to get a popular fighting game as a launch title. 3DO did it with Samurai Showdown, and for the SNES and the Sega Genesis, Street Fighter II and Mortal Kombat were the best-selling titles of that year. Had Atari gotten Mortal Kombat, Samurai Showdown, or Street Fighter 2 as a launch title, that would have made waves, especially Mortal Kombat, without any censorship, or even Street Fighter 2. I think that would have been worth throwing a lot of resources at just to nail down. Last but not least is another ST game that could have made a big impression as a launch title and given marketing a good arrow in their quiver, assuming that the port would take advantage of the JAG's abilities, and that would be Dungeon Master. Perhaps this would have been a difficult effort to turn into something more like Towers 2 than just, say, a straight port with color enhancements, but it would have been worth it. Not just to show the improvements over the ST, but also to bring a well-liked RPG to the system. I would also add that had they launched it in Europe in '93, it would have made sense to have a soccer title as a launch game. While Sensible Soccer was okay and eventually showed up on the Jaguar, I imagine that a remake of Pele's Soccer on the 2600 would have made more sense, especially if it was designed in the vein of SNK's Super Sidekicks series, particularly Ultimate 11, although Ultimate 11 did come along at like 1998, but regardless, that kind of play, but with soccer legend Pele attached to it, perhaps could have moved some units. Of course, we could talk all day about games that the Jag should have had, and perhaps you have some better suggestions than mine. Either way, the main points are: marketing at Atari should have crafted a vision of how they would promote the system from early on, one that would focus on the system's strengths that they could show via a strong launch lineup, and not one that could get bogged down in minutiae like specs and bits. Have more launch titles to provide some variety, and have at least one game there with a decent or strong name attached to it that would have possibly driven sales. Of course, beyond the launch, there was a lot of work to be done, but you don't want to lose that momentum. And had this sort of good sense been around, then I think a better job would have been done to manage the Jaguar among resellers and gamers. There's also something to be said about how Atari treated its developers, its distributors, resellers, as well as journalists. They had a notorious relationship with each of these categories, often being difficult to work with. Now, perhaps a good marketing department could have repaired or solved that, but then again, maybe not. Sometimes bad management is an insurmountable odd. Still, being honest with each of these categories and working to get good games on the platform wouldn't have hurt, just like it doesn't hurt nowadays. Had these issues been fixed, then perhaps the company would have made it to produce the Jaguar 2 and turned things around to have become the company fitting of the legend of the brand that it used to be. It would have been great if they could have attracted some strong creative talent who wouldn't be bogged down by poor management as well, but that's probably a subject for a different video. Or it all could have been futile. We really wouldn't know without having a time machine and going back and changing history. Do you agree with my points on this marketing angle or no? Sound off in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and again, happy birthday to the Atari Jaguar.